Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this 14th of February. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information. And of course, on this day, we certainly love that you're watching Alaska Weather with us tonight. So thank you very much. If you have any questions about this show or anything else that you're looking for on our website, weather.gov/Alaska is the place to start. Please let me know. I'm happy to help you and serve you any way I can. Here's a look at what's going on across the state tonight. We're going to start with areas around Petersburg, Wrangell, down toward Cake, and in the central and southern third or so of the Panhandle. Winter weather advisory is in effect, and it looks like you are in for some snow. You might see a little bit of snow in most parts of southeast tonight and into tomorrow, but it looks like this region here around Cake, Petersburg, Wrangell, probably looking at a higher chance of seeing more accumulating snow, maybe as much as 3 to 5 inches. In some cases, might see as much as 7. So winter weather advisory will go into effect for your area. Now look further north. The interior just swamped with advisories. That's the yellow shade that you see there across the middle and upper Tanana Valley, and to tomorrow midday at least and into the afternoon. Expecting in general about 4 to 6 inches of snow, in some cases higher than 6, maybe up to about 7 inches or so, all the way from Bettles down to Tanana, Fairbanks, up to Fort Yukon, and into the upper Tanana Valley for you. Up around the north slope, around the Barrow region and the northern Arctic coast, maybe as much as an inch of snow with some blowing wind there. Of course, that could reduce visibility. And we're still dealing with wind out here across the Bering Strait region. Because of that, the blizzard conditions have subsided somewhat. They're still there as far as the wind goes, but the strength of that wind has subsided. But we're still getting enough wind to reduce visibility, and you might still see a little bit of additional snow. So winter weather advisory continues for your region. The red shaded areas, though, are winter storm warnings, and in these regions we've got a little more wind and a little more snow, perhaps as much as 6 to 8 inches of snow. The good news is a lot of this will be winding down as we head through the remainder of tonight and into early tomorrow morning, so improving conditions really across the entire region from west to east as we go through the daytime tomorrow. But for right now, every one of these areas that has a little bit of color on it, and same goes for our friends down in southeast, do expect some snow in the next 24 hours. If it is not quite done snowing where you are yet, looks like those conditions will be changing here. And this is why, look at this boundary right here. On the satellite picture, you can see a very strong area of cold air pushing from west to east as that's wringing out the moisture, turning that into snow crystals. That's what's falling on you right now. So already that band has been passing through the Bering Strait community. We've got another band passing through right now, and so really the main issue out around the Bering Strait region is the wind, more so than falling snow in the region. But everywhere ahead of this line, you're still dealing with falling snow as an option in your forecast for the next 24 hours or so. And you can see the moisture bubbling up out of the Gulf of Alaska, heading for parts of southeast, replacing that really nice dry weather you've had with more active weather. And there are several other waves stacked up behind that. You can see another one marching into the central and western parts of the chain, the spiraling shape taking place right here just south of Adak, and that moisture moving northward into the central Bering. A lot of warm air with this as well. Here's a look at the surface picture, and you can see high pressure sitting across western Canada. This is all that big cold we had just days ago is being pushed out now, and all the warmth has replaced that. The wet air in place across the central interior, that's what's snowing on you right now. Even warm enough up around Point Hope and down around the corner to Point Lay to see a little bit of freezing rain on the sensor there. The cold front marching through the west is keeping the snow flying across the interior. Snow started falling in the Anchorage area late this afternoon. Rain around Bristol Bay. Warm air still lifting north across the western Gulf, and you can see that southeast is more clouds than anything else right now, with high pressure sitting across the southern Gulf and low pressure sitting south of the chain. That's at 986 millibars. As we get into tonight, this lifts northward very quickly. The winds stay up across the Bering Strait, and this is going to continue chewing up the ice across the northern Bering Strait. Areas around St. Lawrence Island, a substantial area of marginal ice right now, not pack ice, but marginal ice. You'll see that coming up in the marine segment here in just a few minutes. Areas of rain and snow will continue around the Aleutians there. Occasional stronger winds passing through, as you would expect, with a low just to the north of Adak, Atka, and Kiska later tonight. Areas of light rain passing over the Gulf, and watch for areas of rain and snow across the northern Gulf. And we'll also be watching for some of this to turn into snow across the central and southern half or so of southeastern Alaska, where your winter weather advisory goes into effect for Petersburg, Wrangell, and Cake. Out across the Alcan border, snow will continue through the midday hours, but notice it is improving from west to east. The middle Tanana Valley, the upper Tanana Valley, areas around Fort Yukon. You'll still be dealing with snow probably until about noon or so before some big improvements come your way, but all that comes at about 4 to 6, 7 inches of snow. Low pressure deepens on Thursday afternoon in the northern Bering down to 976 millibars as the front works its way into the west coast once again. Stiff southerly winds working up the west coast, pumping more heat into places like Norton Sound and further. And by Friday, you can see that is really kind of washed out, but we still have a couple disturbances capable of focusing the wind, focusing the snow across the west. And a little bit further south, we now have several other waves stacking in behind that. A 992 millibar low west of the Pribilofs, another one at 970 just west of Shemya. And again, that's helping to keep a lot of the cold air back to the west and keep warm air traveling northward through the Bering Strait and into the Chukchi Sea. High pressures south of the Alaska Peninsula at this point, at 1,034 millibars. And our low is now moving through the central and eastern Gulf. That will focus a little bit more on southeastern Alaska. So it looks like we'll get enough warmth out ahead of that to probably be at least a rain mixed with snow. And then as this moves through, we'll have to watch and see how much cold air lingers across southeast by the end of the week and the weekend. But watch for the surf and the seas to come up a little bit more as this gets closer to the panhandle. Certainly Friday night and into Saturday there. Offshore winds may keep the Anchorage and south central chance for snow somewhat limited, save for the southern parts of the Kenai Peninsula and areas around Kodiak Island and west. Let's take a look at temperatures. It has been cold, but now with that southerly flow and the wet air and clouds across the interior, temperatures have certainly gone back up. For southeast, we're going to start off with temps in the 20s and 30s tomorrow morning. South central, teens and 20s. Kodiak down to 30. The middle Tanana Valley, low to mid-teens there. Certainly not cold for you. 8 around Eagle, 3 around Northway, 3 in Fort Yukon, 5 below in Arctic Village. Single-digit temps for most of the North Slope. The Kotzebue Sound region in the teens. Around Bethel, expect overnight lows in the upper teens as well. Nunivak Island and St. Lawrence Island in the mid-20s, 34 in St. Paul, and above freezing for most of the Alaska Peninsula and the chain. High temperatures for your Thursday in the 30s and 40s for southeast, the capital city just above freezing. 20s and 30s for south central. Prince William Sound will probably stay above freezing tomorrow, 36 around Seward, 38 around Kodiak. In the middle Tanana Valley, mid-20s for daytime high temperatures. Low teens for Anaktivik Pass and Arctic Village. Also looking at single-digit temps around Kaktovik, but everywhere else on the North Slope should be low to mid-teens for you. Kotzebue Sound temperatures, then Shishmaref, 22, 27 around Nome, upper 20s for Unalakleet, and into the upper 20s for most of the YK Delta. McGrath, only mid-20s for you. Cook Inlet temperatures just shy of 30, Kodiak 38, and upper 30s for the chain and the Alaska Peninsula region. St. Paul and St. George 37, down to 33 as we get into Friday morning. You can see some drier air moving through, and I can tell that because temperatures are nosediving once again for the upper Tanana and the upper Yukon valleys, 5 to 15 below, including Fairbanks going sub-zero Friday morning. 20s and 30s for southeast, teens and 20s, and drying out for south central. Kodiak down to 33. Galena, you'll see 6 Friday morning. Kotzebue looking at 15 degrees, 21 in Unalakleet and Nome. St. Lawrence Island 26. Bristol Bay in the upper 20s to lower 30s, a 33 high for St. Paul, or low for St. Paul for Friday afternoon up to 37. And again, we're still looking at cold in the north and the eastern interior for Friday afternoon. Southeast 30s and 40s with Sitka up to 42. Prince William Sound back in the low to mid 30s. Anchorage about 28 on Friday. Mid-teens for the middle Tanana Valley. 20s and 30s for southwest. St. Lawrence Island down to 31.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Time for flying weather now. IFR conditions will be fairly widespread across the interior and the west coast. Also the north slope looking at decreased visibility and ceilings as we go through a large part of your Thursday morning. MVFR starts to spread over the northern and eastern parts of the Gulf into the outer coast of southeast and northern sections as well. IFR conditions south of Unalaska and Dutch Harbor into the North Pacific and widespread MVFR through most of the Bering. but not over St. Matthew Island to areas just west of St. Lawrence Island. As we get into the afternoon, a fast-moving wave will increase IFR from the Gulf of Anadyr southward toward Nunivak Island and Cape Newenham. It looks like MVFR conditions will be fairly widespread through Bristol Bay. Some breaks in there just north of the peninsula and Pilot Point. South of that, covering up most of the peninsula itself. Out to the west, decreasing areas of clouds and low decks. So it looks like VFR conditions there for AKwx and ATCA by the afternoon. IFR conditions set in across some of the higher terrain and the eastern edge of the inner channels there. MVFR out across the outer coast and most of the central and eastern Gulf, with IFR conditions across the North Slope into Barrow and Wainwright, Eagle, Northway, all the way west toward it looks like Fairbanks, and then south of the Alaska range there, generally improving conditions, but look for poor visibility just north of the range itself. By Friday, once again, another fast-moving wave zipping into south and western Alaska with IFR conditions spreading into Shelikof Strait, Kodiak Island, Lake Iliamna approaching from the west, and then all the way across some of the higher terrain of the Aleutian Range. Looking for hit-and-miss IFR conditions across some of the lower terrain of the Middle Tanana Valley and areas westward across the Middle Yukon Valley. The Upper Yukon hit and miss there. Looks like areas around Fort Yukon, southward toward Eagle should see IFR with MVFR conditions around Northway, and Tok westward looks like VFR conditions pretty much will be the rule. Southeast looking at improvements, but still lingering MVFR there, and IFR back again across the North Slope from Atkasuk to Barrow out toward Wainwright and eastward as you head out toward Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse. So that will continue into Friday afternoon, but many other locations across the interior, south central, southeast, still looking at VFR conditions with MVFR fairly widespread across the YK Delta into the Middle Yukon Valley, Norton Sound and Nome. Out to the west, MVFR conditions from St. Lawrence Island to St. Matthew all the way down toward Adak. And westward, hit and miss there with another wave coming up into the Gulf. You can get kind of a sense of some IFR building here across the central Gulf with MVFR over Kodiak Island. Let's take a look at your pass conditions in detail. Anaktuvuk and Adigan passes we saw will be at MVFR condition there for most of the day tomorrow. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass should see improvements as we go. We expect to see similar trends for Rainy Pass. Windy Pass probably will hold at MVFR conditions through most of the day. Isabel Pass we expect to see MVFR. Mentasta Pass also looking to see MVFR to start, but in this case it will probably worsen to IFR as the day goes on. Tonita Pass we expect to see VFR conditions by the end of tomorrow afternoon. Portage Pass starts at IFR with improvements expected by the end of the day, and Chilkoot and White Pass likely holding at MVFR through most of your Thursday. Freezing levels indicate some warm air at the surface is building northward with a continued wave after wave of moisture and southwesterly winds building in. But down to the south, in the Gulf Coast, we've really pushed that warm air aloft down south of the central Gulf and just south of Unalaska, Dutch Harbor, Nikolsky, and out of range of southeastern Alaska. So just about everybody in the mainland right now is below freezing at the surface, and you can see that surface freezing line pretty much running the Gulf of Alaska coastline. Icing potential right now is climbing as far as altitude goes, above 8,000 feet for some of the west and southwestern locations, St. Lawrence Island all the way down toward areas around Ammonok, Cape Newenham, and then most of the Alaska Peninsula there, and then hit and miss across the chain. Levels there only getting higher. Above 4,000 feet for the North Slope and below 8,000 feet for Eagle, Northway, Tok, Fort Yukon, out toward Fairbanks there, as we're still draining out some of the coldest air away from Alaska. A ridge is building in the upper atmosphere. You can see it taking shape here across the mainland with southerlies across the west coast, northerlies across the Alcan border, and that cold, fast flow is draining across southeast with wind speeds at 100 to 120 knots. 9,000 feet, you can see that northwesterly flow here, 25 to 30 knots at about the 700 millibar level, 20 to 50 knots or so from the west and southwest over the Gulf, and then low pressure across the central Bering Sea with wind speeds between 50 and 60 knots, just as fast or faster there at 3,000 feet with high pressure anchored over south central Alaska. Our northwesterly flows across the Alcan are light, westerly onshore flow across the southern parts of southeast, and generally southerlies across the west coast. So that's where we'll focus on for turbulence below 3,000 and 4,000 feet. Considerable chop and turbulence there, and moderate below 4,000 for the eastern interior.
The National Weather Service supplies instruments to measure air temperatures. The wet and dry bulb temperature shelter and the sling psychrometer use muslin wicking wetted with distilled water or the purest water available. If the apparent wind is under 9 knots, you must whirl the psychrometer. The passage of air over the wet bulb will provide sufficient evaporation for an accurate reading. The temperature will drop quite rapidly and then more slowly. Read the thermometer as soon as possible after ventilation has stopped and report the lowest reading observed on the form. The code card specifies the format for recording this information, as well as the dew point. Dew point is the temperature at which the air becomes saturated with moisture. It's determined from a table using the wet bulb temperature and the wet bulb depression, the difference between the dry and wet bulb readings.
In addition to the sling psychrometer on board ships, they often use a temperature shelter for the determination of wet and dry bulb temperatures. Now you got to remember to keep the reservoir here filled with water so as you can avoid an erroneous reading on the wet bulb temperature. Now in this area, the determination of dew point doesn't seem too important. But up north, it's of vital importance in the prediction of fog.
Sea level pressure is probably the most important measurement requiring great precision in observing. It is an excellent predictor of changing weather conditions. The pressure aneroid barometer is the standard pressure reading instrument for voluntary observing ships. It's installed and maintained by the National Weather Service. Pressure readings are recorded in millibars.
Barometric pressure is probably the single most important piece of data that can be supplied by a ship for giving meteorological data. Now, the barometric pressure is important because it is what drives the wind field, and the wind field is what creates the waves. And obviously, the waves are of most importance to the mariner himself. Now, when you go to read the barometer, make sure that you're standing directly opposite the dial and you're looking straight down on the dial. Traditionally, mariners have also, they can't keep their fingers off it and they give it a few taps to settle the needle, which may have been stuck. After that, be sure you get an accurate reading and record it in the appropriate code on the format.
The recording device is called the barograph. It produces a permanent record of sea level pressure over time, called the barogram. The paper must be renewed once every 4 days when the clock is rewound.
The barograph differs from the barometer only in one aspect. It records the actual barometric pressure on a revolving drum and an ink point pen. Now this gives an indication of a rise, a fall, or a steady state of the barometric pressure. In this case, in the last few hours, you can see a significant drop in the barometric pressure of about 2 millibars.
Barogram trends are compared to the code card and reported as the appropriate number. Sea temperature is an important observation for the meteorologist and oceanographer. Reading the temperature of the ship's condenser intake water is the most popular method.
Yeah, third, can you please give me the sea temperature?
Remember, all temperatures are reported in Celsius. It's most important for the observer to include as many groups in the synoptic code as possible. If any information is not available, such as when observing at night, include as much data as you can and code your weather message by using slashes for missing data. Do not transmit groups that contain all slashes. Your weather observations are important. It's best to transmit reports as soon as possible after the observation has been taken. But if ship operations prevent transmission at or near the reporting hour, send the report as soon as you can. All reports begin with the code BBXX, the indicator for weather reports from a sea station. This is followed by the ship's radio call sign. This allows the communications network to route the data to the appropriate file for marine observations and to give credit to the ship for submitting the report. Ships' weather observations can be sent to the National Weather Service through U.S. Coast Guard stations, Inmarsat Coast Earth stations, and commercial shore radio stations. All completed ship's weather observation forms should be saved and mailed to your port meteorological officer using the provided postage-paid envelopes. These records are archived and made available to meteorologists and climatologists for research. Professional publications such as Marine Pilot Charts use the data as well. This is a never-ending process of collection, analysis, and forecasting. The marine weather forecast depends on the data collected by volunteer ship observers. Commercial ship routing services use it to plot the safest and most efficient course, since time is money for shipping companies. Scientists use the information to learn more about the oceans. The maritime community is particularly sensitive to and dependent on the weather. The accuracy of a high seas forecast is crucial to maintaining safety and meeting time schedules. Your participation is a vital element of this information gathering network. You will receive great satisfaction from participating in this program by knowing that your efforts result in safety for all those who go down to the sea in ships.
Well, that's about it as far as reporting weather at sea goes. Remember, accuracy and timeliness of delivery. Only you know what the weather's like at your position at sea. Record it and report it.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Time for your marine forecast. We'll start with the sea ice edge as we always do. And one thing that really pops out to me is the area around St. Lawrence Island today. Marginal ice there from St. Lawrence Island north and west toward the Gulf of Anadyr and all the way further west and south, of course. We also have plenty of marginal ice across the northern parts of the Yukon Delta north of Nunivak Island. And with the current weather pattern, it's not out of the question that a lot more of this marginal ice zone is going to shift northward into the Bering Strait. You can see already some marginal ice north of Shishmaref, and we'll have to see what happens after that. But it certainly looks like the ice edge, and certainly that marginal ice zone is shifting northward through the Bering Strait as we head into the weekend and the rest of the week for sure. Southwest is pretty much sea ice free. There's some very low concentrations of ice. Most of that's really up on the beach there across Southwest. So a lot of changes and a lot of warmth so far. No surprise if you're out there already. Here's a look at what's going on in Southeast. Light winds across the Lynn Canal for now, 15 knots, 3-foot seas. Southeasterlies on the inside from Petersburg all the way down toward Clarence Strait there, 3-foot seas on the inside. The outer coast, you're looking at 15 knots up north, 10 to 15 knots down south, about 5 to 6 foot seas. Things are going to change a little bit though as we get into Friday. Low pressure is starting to work its way in from the west. You can see the winds wrapping into it right about here. That's going to start drawing in more wind across the Lynn Canal. Remember I said for now, of course it's going to be windy around Skagway and Haines. 30 knots with a 6-foot sea. 20 to 25 knots from the north and northwest as you go further south across the Inside Passage. North and northeasterlies all the way from the Dixon entrance up toward Yakutat. That's still holding around 15 to 20 knots, though. 7 to about 9-foot seas there for Friday. For South Central, northwesterly flow coming out of Prince William Sound, 20 knots with 3-foot seas on the inside, 5-foot seas on the outside. Northerlies over the ice down to Kenai, and then the wind picks up a little bit more as you would expect. 15 knots there, 4 to 5-foot seas from the western Barrens northward, and then 15 to 20 knots outside of Resurrection Bay and east of the Barrens. Expecting about 4 to 5-foot seas there on Thursday. Then we get into that northeasterly flow again. Remember, low pressure's out here. So we're drawing that wind around in that counterclockwise fashion. Northerlies still light on the inside of the Sound, 15 to 20 knots on the southern Cook Inlet. about 5 to 6 foot seas developing there as we get into Friday afternoon. For Thursday, a lot more wind west of the Alaska Peninsula. You see southeasterlies developing across the peninsula, 25 to 30 in the entire region. 4 to 8 foot seas for Bristol Bay, westward down the Bering Sea coast, 8 to 9 foot seas for the Pacific coast, 3 foot seas inside of Shelikof Strait, and still a light wind coming into Kodiak Island, only around 10 knots or so. Friday, the winds start to switch around a little bit more, feeding into low pressure to your east, north and northwesterly winds, 20 to 35 knots across the western Gulf, and then 20 knots generally around most of the Alaska Peninsula, except for Castle Cape to Chignik. That's 30 knots with a 10-foot sea. And once again, most of the wind and higher seas to your west. So in the Aleutians we go. Winds up to 30 to 40 knots in most areas here. 11 to 18-foot seas across the central chain. 12 to 20-foot seas across the Pacific coastline. West and northwesterly winds developing here across the west, but you see southeasterlies already feeding into the next weather maker there from Kiska to Attu on Thursday. As we get into Friday, we get back into storm force winds for Adak and Atka. This will really start up for Thursday night, in fact, so be prepared for much stronger winds as early as Thursday night and lasting into Friday. 35 to 45 knots in most of the central region. You're looking at 15 to as high as 26 foot seas on the Pacific coast and 25 to 27 foot seas out in the west as we get into Friday there. All looking at a stronger southerly flow as early as late Wednesday night out west, and then Thursday night into Friday for the central chain. South and southeasterlies for the eastern chain, still generally milder there. Southeasterly winds coming up the west coast again. This is what's chewing up the ice. Easterlies coming off of Amonica and Hooper Bay, 40 knots there. 35 knots for St. Matthew, St. Paul, and St. George. 16-foot seas expected on Thursday. And then that southerly warm flow continues to blow northward towards St. Lawrence Island, 25 to 35 knots there. The 7 to 9 foot seas closer to the coast and around Etolan Strait and Nunivak Island. But St. Matthew, St. Paul, and St. George are all looking at 35 knots with 19-foot seas there at their highest. For the North Slope, light easterlies across the Beaufort Sea, south and southwesterlies for the Chukchi Sea, 15 knots over the ice, 40 knots though from the east north of St. Lawrence Island, becoming 30 knots from the south on Friday. Light winds continue for the Beaufort on Friday. A stronger offshore flow develops though for the Chukchi, 25 to 30 knots there on Friday. Recapping tonight's weather, it's snow for the interior, anywhere from about 4 to 7 inches in general. Some places a little bit west may see more closer to the front. That's moving from west to east. Watch for snow to continue in places like Fairbanks as we go through the rest of the midday hours tomorrow. Rain will change to snow across the central parts of the Panhandle. A winter weather advisory for Petersburg, Wrangell, and Cake as we go into later tonight and early tomorrow. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather. See you tomorrow.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.